Okay, folksies. So, I had one of them long, deep thinks on the way to a dancing, I don't know what to call it, a chance to go to this opportunity. It takes me like 2 hours to walk to and from where I was going. And right now you're questioning my sanity, and that's reasonable. But that doesn't mean, just because I'm not sane, that my thoughts aren't perhaps accurate. And it had to do, I was recently reminded because of one of them internet memes, Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, talking about the politicization of global warming. And it's true. The right, certainly, with climate change denial or human influence denial on climate change, however you want to take it, has certainly politicized the issue in a ridiculous form. But they are not alone in the matter, and I'll get to that briefly. So first of all, from the right's point of view, you have some people claim, hey, climate change just isn't happening. Well, obviously, these are people who are just putting their head in the sand and saying, la, 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 right? Like, oh, there's a snowball in, in Washington, D.C., I can make a snowball and throw it at you in Congress, and therefore there's no climate change. We have a bad winter. I mean, that's just obviously such bullshit if you think about it. It's like saying, look, I found a Mexican, who crossed the border illegally, so all Mexicans cross the border illegally. It's just completely ridiculous. So we can dismiss these people. Some of them take a faith-based approach to say, so there is some dispute how much of climate change is human-created and how much is not. Okay, but some of them take a faith-based approach to saying there is no human effect on climate change, because how could humans affect something as big as the Earth? Well, let's think about it. First of all, we have massively changed the Earth in so many ways. We can change small location weather patterns through seeding clouds. We can do some pretty significant effect. Deforestation is obviously changing the impact as to how much, oxygen, how much carbon dioxide is being converted to oxygen, etc. So there are obviously things we can do if you just try to think rationally. But don't these people remember the concept of nuclear winter? Do they deny that as well? Because if they think that we could just lob nukes and it would just be a short-term casualty situation, these are people who are kind of disqualified, I think, from any rational discourse. They're so tied up in their fairy tale existence that they read from some Bronze Age set of scriptures that you really have to just put them with the other cultists who deny reality. And, they're really not any different from the people who are saying there's no global warming, right? They're just as blank in terms of being able to understand anything. Now, already we have a fair percentage, I think, of the kinds of people, and it's probably the same kind of people who can say, oh, well, yeah, Trump may not be everything I want, but he's obviously better than Clinton. But regardless of that, if you're looking at these until, wait, he's talking about grabbing some pussy, wait, there's something really wrong there. But there are still people who even aren't affected by that. But come on, with how much he's said already, this can't be surprising. But we're going off on a tangent, and I completely understand disliking both of them. So, I think we can dismiss most of the people on the right who are just, either denying climate change or denying human impact on climate change. But we look at the left, and they have a very similar kind of denial. They seem completely unwilling to even consider other factors that are affecting climate change. I'm not necessarily talking about sunspots here, although there could be some effect of that. There are natural causes. We've had severe climate change in the history of the Earth, maybe not as rapid, but we've had severe, it certainly is indications that it has been as rapid in certain cases. Due to natural phenomena that we have not seen anything like, but, heavy volcanic activity and stuff like that. We have seen cases where there's been tremendous climate change. And it's been linked to polar flipping, which is another issue, but we don't know what causes what. We don't know a lot, okay? That's part of the problem here. And that's part of what the right uses as their attack is, well, you don't know enough to be able to address the issue. And in some sense that's correct. But then they also try to limit the studies on climate change. And there are states where you can't use the word climate change, you can't use global warming, you cannot use sea level rise, you can't use any of these terms. This is like, again, this is that ridiculous strain, but it controls sections of our government, which is just despicable, really. I mean, the government should be made up of mainly voices that are generally reasonable. They may have differing views, as they once did, about things like slavery with, well, economically we can't afford not to have it. Or it would be too dangerous to remove it, or something like that. Those are understandable cases. Trying to make an argument that slavery is okay because it doesn't really exist, or something like that, would be equally ludicrous. It would be the analog of what we're seeing right now on the right. But what we're seeing on the left is this commitment to a singular cause, for the most part, at least on the political sphere, not so much in the scientific community, but a singular cause, which is carbon emissions, and pointing to fossil fuels as the main factor of carbon emissions. But there are other significant causes for this. For example, methane emissions. And this comes up sometimes, the I don't know, we'll call them anti-environmentalists or whatever, saying, wait a minute, cattle. We have a huge number of cattle. This is part of the problem. Methane is a heavier concentration as a greenhouse gas than carbon is by far, and we have this humongous, quantity of livestock that we've never seen before, because, I'm told 7 billion people. We're approaching 10, though. It's not in the far future. In order to keep feeding that many people, and in countries like China, where meat eating had never been a major source of proteins, it's now becoming more and more accessible and popular. And if we're going to start to see that kind of growth in, a diet which includes a significant amount of livestock protein, well, we're going to have to see more livestock than we even have now. And those numbers are just going to keep rising. There are other possible things. There are semi-natural ones. For example, there's a tipping point at which essentially pockets of methane contained within either underwater or under ice deposits are being exposed and end up into the atmosphere. And there's indications that that's already happening. And there's sort of a feeling, well, there's a reasonable argument to say that we're past a point of no return, and I believe this argument actually, in the sense that when we first started noticing global warming patterns accelerating? Because if you remember back to the 70s, there was a worry of an ice age. Now there's still a worry of that, and that has to do with actually the global warming. It can trigger an ice age, or if enough of the greenhouse gases are emitted, it could actually start to prevent solar radiation from coming into the amount necessary to cause global warming, and it could start a global cooling factor as well. And then there's also some having to do with ocean currents and the ice, the very cold ice falling in, being able to trigger something. I don't fully understand that one, but I've seen the argument. And the point is that we really don't know where we're heading, and we don't know all the reasons why. And we really ought to be studying that as a global survival issue. Now, I'm not saying the whole planet's going to die because of that, but we're in the middle of a mass extinction event already, probably due to human causes, not just global warming, but also human expansion overall. There's strong signs that we may be losing, a large proportion of our environmental diversity in terms of ecosystems, in terms of actual species, etc. So, all the warning signs are there, and they've been there for a long time. Global warming didn't get really a lot of airtime until we started hitting the 1980s. And by that point, I think we were already probably at the point where it was almost too late. And at this point, I think we're too late. I think we've already started triggering certain effects that, even if we shut down, even if we just wiped out every human effect possible and killed off humanity or whatever, it might be too late, And then when you take into account the fact that there's political will involved here, the Paris Accord is hard to accept in the U.S. Politically, it is, a knife-edge type issue that may or may not be acceptable at all, and we may pull out depending on, whether or not the elections swing one way or another. And even the perpetrators of the Accord, if that's the right word for this, even the architects of it, admit that it's nowhere near strong enough using that sort of politically correct leftist liberal view that carbon emissions are the prime problem here. It's too little. It might mitigate some of the effects. It might slow down global warming a little bit. But my own impression, and again, I'm completely ignorant essentially, but probably less so than the majority of people who, weigh in on the subject from a point of ignorance, is that we've actually triggered some of these methane releases to the point where, the human activity probably isn't the main thing anymore. We would have to figure out some way of coping with that. But without adequate study of these alternative explanations, as well as human-produced carbon, then we have to seriously consider, what kind of defenses we can take. Now, if we're taking a shot in the dark of, if we cut back carbon emissions sufficiently, we'd halt this. Something we don't know, right? If we take a shot in the dark of that, you'd think we would take a bigger shot in the dark, right? Let's not just worry about carbon. Let's worry about the methane, the human-created methane, as it were, through the livestock, through the food industry, through people farting even, okay? Through deforestation, which isn't methane exposure, but it's a way of fixing the carbon and getting it out of the atmosphere and replenishing it with more oxygen. So there's just such a broad swath of things we'd have to take care of. And there's not the political will to do this. You go to Brazil, not that I have, but if you go to Brazil, there's not going to be a tremendous strong force for halting their expansion of their economy by, leaving the rainforests intact. Anywhere you go, their economic growth is reliant on activities that cause permanent and lasting harm of some sort or another, and to a large extent, it's going to be lasting harm going across, affecting the climate in general, raising those greenhouse gas levels. Now, it's kind of funny. One of my potential solutions, again, total ignorance here, but one of my potential solutions was ozone is one of the strongest of the greenhouse gases, and we were all, maybe I'm misstating even there, but the whole world was so terrified of the hole in the ozone layer. Now, that may have been suppressing the warming rate. And we're so happy that we solved this great problem by, reducing fluorocarbons, etc., so that, it wouldn't be eating away at the ozone. But the truth might be that by fixing that problem, we exacerbated what our current issue really is. And that was covering up some of the input into the global warming, and we weren't really able to see that the heavy levels of industrialization that we saw starting in the 19th century, really, have been significantly affecting warming. And we might have noticed earlier, panicked earlier, and maybe done something correct in time. Is trying to burn a hole in the ozone layer one possible solution or part of the solution? Maybe. Is anybody studying that? Not that I know of. There are people studying the effects of, the cattle and maybe other natural effects. But the money going into that and the effort going into that is much, much less, and it's often being done by actors who have a financial stake in trying to claim that they're not responsible, that fossil fuels aren't responsible, i.e. what you're seeing is the fossil fuel companies performing that kind of research to try to provide cover for themselves. And that's problematic in and of itself. Anyway. In terms of mobilizing the type of global effort that you need, I don't think you can have local, national governments, as it were, being able to handle this kind of size problem. The trade-offs and the deals that would have to be arranged and the potential for cheating and the advantages to doing so are just too high. And this is one of many reasons why I'm not really convinced that our current world model makes any sense anymore. I've been considering that for a long time, but it seems to me that the national distinction and each country having its own policies, etc., when trying to deal with what is really a global threat is somewhat obscene. Now, one of the clear things, if we were taking that shot in the dark approach, right? Let's do something that solves it, but this is completely unpalatable. And again, for those Bronze Age ethos that we have, is a significant reduction in humans. So, I think humans could make a dent by cutting back on the fossil fuels they use. There's no question there. But the fossil fuels aren't the root cause here. We're also looking at the animal production. The existence of 7 billion humans, this, that, and the other, is all part of the problem. And this, again, would require an extra national type of will, right? The United States actually has close to zero population growth if you don't count immigration. But there are many, many countries where there's still significant population growth. And when you look at, to take China again, as their, what once was their one-child policy, and now I think it's a two-child policy, this is condemned throughout the world as, some kind of invasion of human rights. Both nations and perhaps the world as a whole essentially operate as an insane person, right? I mean, nations act psychopathically. If you tried to view a human's behavior, if you tried to equate what a nation does to what an individual human does in terms of international relations, this is just somebody who would fall under the criminal code in so many cases. It's either extortion or outright, robbery, murder, this, that, and the other. All of these things, and I'm talking about murder on the nation-state level, where one nation is willing to take out another nation, give all of its goods to some new thing, just because they don't agree with the other one, or because they have, they feel threatened. Right? You have first strikes because you feel threatened. Imagine that. Yeah, my neighbor's got a lot of guns, and I don't feel comfortable with that. I think I'm just going to shoot him first, because I don't know, he might just go, right? Or he's trying to acquire a better gun. I see him going out and about to get an assault rifle, and yeah, I'm just not comfortable with that. I think I'm going to plug him in between the eyes for that. That's the kind of thinking that nations seem to apply to themselves. It's clearly psychotic within a civilized community, and there's no civilized community of nations when it comes down to it. There have been times where there have been hints towards it, the Congress of Europe, and then post-World War II. Generally what happens there is you have, an international calamity that's human-created, like the 30 Years' War, where everybody just steps back and says, wow, we don't want to do that again. Or World War II. Wow, that was pretty extreme. Let's not do that. But the pattern of history repeats itself again and again. We keep going back and doing that eventually. Yeah, we're good. We set certain rules. We make, all right, civilians shouldn't be targeted. That was after the 30 Years' War, right? Military began to treat itself as something that operated outside the plane of civilian casualties. And then certainly by World War I, civilians became targets again. We were looking to destroy the economic base of the enemy, their capability to fight, right, by destroying their home, their home front, through bombing and through other means. And that really hasn't completely gone away, although the full-scale warfare that went around with it, carpet bombing a city or something, that hasn't been done too much recently. So we can't trust these nation states. Now, could we trust a world government any better? I don't know. That's the rub. Whatever happens when you start conglomerating more and more people seems to be a hideous thing. There are economies of scale, and that would be needed to solve this problem. But there are threats. The bigger the governing force that you put in place, and the more powerful it is, and the more it has no restraints on it in terms of military that's able, or some kind of force that's able to just say no to what it's doing, the more risk you're at from other means, from some sort of tyranny. Is tyranny that bad? Well, I don't know, because that's kind of the thing that we're looking at here. So the kind of move that you'd have, say putting a one-child policy on the world as a whole to cut back on the overpopulation situation that is leading to these humongous changes to our world, our environment. There's one way you can look at this is, hey, we could work real hard and try to build a space program and try to, get out of this one solar system, get our eggs out of one basket. That makes sense. But we're not going to do that in time to prevent ourselves from having humongous misery in the near future. So I think beyond any kind of thoughts of that nature, which also seem to be beyond the reach of any one nation or any, because there are other things. Hey, we need to make sure the coal miners still have their jobs. We can't afford to put that much money into the space program. We have to make sure kids have school lunch. You know, we have to spend billions of dollars on preventing people from killing themselves with recreational drugs. Okay, why? I don't know, but these are just things that we've decided for whatever reason. But there's like I said, there's a certain decision point that has to be made. That's a decision point that can't be made at the national level. But can it be made at the international level? Could there be some kind of governing body that could make that choice? And I think there, if you had any form of populism behind the government, you'd have a problem. And it's kind of funny because, you know, I hate the idea of a lack of freedom that comes with sort of the totalitarian communist type model. But to tell you the truth, that model managed to do some pretty big things at a cost, you know, in terms of catching up with the rest of the world, etc. Maybe not any better than the industrial era did for, you know, the West. In terms, it seems to have done it in a more compressed period, but it did so at a huge cost of violating what were seen as sort of these natural rights. And there's sort of a question there, you know, how important is it that China become a first world power, that Russia become a first world power, as compared to their individual members, you know, human rights, etc. And I think that's a fair argument that would be really tough, at least from my background, to say, you know, it was worth the gulags and murdering 20 million people and the Cultural Revolution, this, that, and the other, some of which seems just as psychotic as any other nation, because look at the end result. You know, these countries have caught up and they're technologically and economically giants who are able to play on the world stage. Well, I don't know if that end result is terribly good. What is the effect on the standard of living? Well, that clearly did improve overall, but again, at what costs? And they've allowed their populations to grow because of these advances, which could be seen as a negative or a positive. It gives them more power as a country, but it gives them more of an effect, you know, on the global sustainable existence, right? So it's very hard to make that argument that it was worthwhile to have communism in Soviet Russia or to have communism in communist China. But on the other hand, if you're looking at something that's threatening potentially a huge percentage of the population and dooming them to miserable conditions of further warfare, resource starvation, and simply just, you know, living in miserable conditions, land disappearing under people, whether you're going to have mass migrations, etc. Well, that's pretty bad. And it might be worth reflecting on how fucking important is it that we be able to hop on each other and breed like rabbits. How big a deal is that? Why do we need to be able to do that? Why is this some God-given right, right? I mean, look, I don't have a right to go dump my paint into the water supply, right? Just because I want to get rid of my paint. If I get caught doing that, I've done something wrong. But it's a freedom, you know. It's something that I can physically do. I have that capability. But we've kind of accepted that I shouldn't do that because of the possible bad effects that it can have on the environment. Likewise, overpopulation has significant horrible effects. Not just, you know, I mean, the result of that overpopulation is going to suffer it, but everyone in the future is going to suffer. Where do we get the idea that we have that need to spawn? It seems based really in, like I said, Bronze Age, early agricultural, agricultural, as agriculture was beginning to really become established in humanity, you start seeing these, yeah, we want to create more people because of economies of scale, primarily. The more people that you have in your culture, the more capable you are of defending that culture and keeping its existence going. Cultures which had that kind of principle kept existing. This didn't apply so much for hunter-gatherers. They didn't have that be fruitful and multiply type injunction on them. But you start seeing it as you get into the late Neolithic maybe, and certainly once you're in the Bronze Age, where you're really, there's a strong advantage to a society which is willing to grow. And if you're looking at things from, I'm trying to remember what it is, it's a form of cultural anthropology, it's materialism, or I don't remember, cultural materialism or something like that, which really ties, in effect, you know, the moral codes that our various societies have created are really dependent and derived from the needs that that culture had as it was forming and as it was putting down its roots. Now, there is the possibility for slow change. And historically, I think we've seen this with richer cultures, etc., that start becoming overpopulated, start seeing higher incidences in non-procreative sex. So you see, you know, incidences of homosexuality, of celibacy, etc., starting to rise in such situations. And then these become ingrained, but that's a very, very slow process. Cultural evolution is nowhere near as slow as physical evolution. We're not going to physically evolve to meet the kind of climate change that we're facing. Really, those genes have to be there, and maybe there are in our ability for tool use and technological development, but, and that's another possibility. Maybe what we need to do is just say screw it to the earth, and we're going to dig down and we're going to create a self-sustained, you know, livable environments that aren't on the exterior of the planet so much. That also would require a tremendous will. I think it would be easier to cut back on humanity. But again, you know, one route we have to take is we have to understand where the problem's coming from. Can we affect it? Can we do anything? Another might be take shotgun approaches to try to reduce the effect and mitigate the problem. And then a final is there a technological solution that can protect us from the problem even if we can't reduce its effects terribly much, which might not require understanding the root causes that much. So a significant increase in the amount of research that's going into climate change and a strong understanding of what is going on. There's not the will in America, there's not the will worldwide to really focus that. The political will seems focused on trying to prove the carbon emissions of the problem. We're not shooting out and doing the full exploration to the degree that we want to. Yes, we are trickling funds one way or another. The fuel companies are doing it. Some research institutions are doing it, but it's not open-minded enough to be the kind of research that we really need. Two, if we're going to take mitigating effects, consider very strongly what those might be, and try to take the social and political effects to change it. And three, possibly researching and preparing for the technological solution, which might be leaving the system or establishing space colonies of some sort or another. It might be digging down and trying to create an ecosystem of our own that's completely man-made. It might be bubble cities. It might be a lot of things. But none of the will is focused in any of these directions to the degree that it needs to be to face this kind of challenge. Now, like I said, there's the tendency of societies to slowly try to fix problems. And those might help. There might be sort of that natural balance that comes into play. But then you start thinking about, there are plenty of species that have gone extinct because they've failed, because they can't rely on anything except that gradual change, either evolutionary or behavioral evolution, that they just can't fix. And they can't change what kind of animal they like to eat or what kind of plant they like to eat. Even though they could be fed something else, they can't make that determination individually. That's that kind of slow change, and our societal changes would be of that same nature, I think, as a behavioral change. And I don't think we can fairly rely on that as being able to weed out our problem. And it's kind of funny because the same people who are sticking their head in the sand and saying it's not a problem are also the same people who are most opposed in general to things like homosexuality, which, and very, very opposed in some cases, especially on the Catholic side, to trying to limit birth, even when it's voluntary by the people involved, even when it's not a matter of some kind of force coming in from externally to make them, sterilize them, because, hey, you've had 2 kids already, man. Your quota's up. And if you think about, migration patterns, for example, how these change, sometimes a pack will go extinct simply because it can't change its migration pattern quickly enough. Again, behavioral type patterns. So I just don't think we can rely on that kind of slow-moving process to handle what is really a historically, it's not even historical, but in terms of the span of the Earth's life, a very, very rapid change in climate that we have seldom, if ever, seen, and usually is accompanied with mass die-offs. Well, I think always, like we're seeing now. So, how do we get that well? And what has to be done? And unfortunately, in order to have the will to discard our national boundaries and our identity as societies, and be willing to come together and give away some of the rights and freedoms that we have under those circumstances, I don't see a way, short of catastrophic war or the same kind of gradual changes that we don't have the time to rely on. But anyway, the big point that I have to make here is really it's not just a one-sided thing. The left is as committed, well, I don't think it's the big point, but the thing that sparked this all, the left is just as committed to their own ideological view of the whole problem and how to solve it. Now, the kind of neat thing about it is they're taking kind of an agile approach. Well, let's try something, but in some cases you have to throw the kitchen sink at it. In World War II, there were 2 nuclear bombs, or 2 atomic bombs that were created because we didn't know which one would work, if either. Multiple different strategies were attempted. Bombing, this, that, and the other, preparation for an invasion, blockade, all these things, because you've got to throw everything at something when it's this big of a problem. You can't just sit back and say, okay, you know what? I think that we'll just give peace a chance and we'll try negotiating with Hitler after he took France. Maybe he'll agree to give it back, and we'll stop rearming, and we'll stop actually having any hostile intention. It's along that lines if you take one approach. If you pick the wrong approach, Or if you pick one that maybe has some benefits but isn't sufficient in and of itself, you fail. And you don't really want to fail at this. I think the consequences look pretty dire. Anyway, it's just something that's been buzzing around in my head for a while, and I thought I'd take care of it now.